We use our hands to do many things. Entertain, build, create, communicate, nurture. Sometimes we use our hands with urgency in situations where the clock is winding down and every second counts. And maybe, if fate places us in the right circumstance, where it's a matter of life and death.
I had a great life. I had a beautiful wife, 2 lovely girls. I was 38 years old at the time, was in good shape. The thought that I might be at risk for heart disease was not there. And I show up, and the last thing I expected to do was drop dead that day.
Got up one morning to go to the fitness center to work out. I'd been doing it several months. And I walk in, and there's 7 or 8 people standing, and I see Stuart laying on the floor, motionless. A couple other seconds go by. I say, not a doctor. I took CPR course about 6 months previously. And so I checked his pulse, and I certainly didn't feel anything. But then he had just a split second worth of doubt where you try and figure out what you really do next, and then you just know this guy doesn't have any air, and his heart's not beating, and I launched into CPR. Fortunately, after doing it for several minutes, the paramedics showed up, and they put the defib on him. He did not have a pulse. They shocked him a couple of times and brought him back.
There had been 6 to 8 people witness me. When I had the event, they didn't know what was going on. They thought I was having a seizure. They did call 911, and the club did have a defibrillator.
I had attended a wedding several years earlier, and a gentleman had gone down, and I really watched how nobody acted. Fortunately, that gentleman turned out to be okay. It wasn't a fatal heart event. But I always told myself I just really needed to go get the training, because I didn't want to be in a position where I couldn't help in the event I was faced with those circumstances again.
Without Steve, without CPR, I just wouldn't be here. The gift that he's given me is extraordinary. Just the time that I've had with my family, with my children, you can't put a price on that.
This story of life restored, like countless other rescue stories involving CPR, is a testament to the heroism of ordinary people willing to step forward and help save a life. Equally inspiring is the story behind the quest to sustain life that gave birth to CPR 50 years ago. Accounts of resuscitating a lifeless body date back to the Old Testament, but using mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as a preferred technique didn't emerge until the mid-18th century, when a Scottish physician used the technique to revive a man in a coal pit. For a time, the medical community in Britain and Europe embraced the method. Then it fell out of favor in the early 19th century. New opinions held that exhaled air didn't contain enough oxygen. Plus, scientists had recently discovered germs. Over the ensuing decades, well-intentioned people would propose countless techniques to restart a victim's breathing, particularly drowning victims, from hanging them up to drain, to rolling them over a barrel, to the more sophisticated but equally useless arm lift method, which was widely used in the early 20th century. The modern use of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation began in the 1950s when a polio epidemic gripped the nation. A young Dr. James Elam was on the wards of University Hospital in Minnesota when he saw nurses rapidly wheeling a teenage boy down the corridor. The boy was turning blue, clearly just moments from death. The night before, Dr. Elam had read about an unorthodox method of resuscitating a non-breathing patient, and his instincts told him to use it now. As others looked on and gasped, he placed his mouth over the boy's and blew air into his lungs.
In 3 breaths, he was pink. I was then advised by the smart intern that I would get polio. I guess I was just cocky, I don't know. There's also the fact that here's a human being about to die. And I knew the manual methods wouldn't work either. I didn't have any oxygen. Yes, I did, right there.
Dr. Elam's bold and compassionate act saved the boy's life. Ironically, Dr. Elam's proposal to make mouth-to-mouth resuscitation a standard procedure was rejected, even after his own extensive studies proved it worked. It would take a chance meeting at a medical conference between Dr. Elam and Dr. Peter Safar to regain momentum.
I was then chief anesthesiologist at Baltimore City Hospital in the 50s. So in 56, Elam and his exhaled air work and his personality sparked me from resuscitation teaching and practice into resuscitation research.
Safar was so impressed, he returned to Baltimore and enlisted the city's fire department in a dramatic experiment. 40 volunteers, including doctors, medical students, and a single nurse, courageously consented to be chemically paralyzed to stop normal breathing, allowing a dozen firemen to test various techniques of artificial ventilation. Safar and his assistants carefully monitored the blood oxygen level in the volunteers. When it dropped to an unsafe level during resuscitation attempts, they quickly administered oxygen with a manual pump. Of all the methods attempted, only one produced a blood oxygen level that would keep someone alive in the field: mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Within 2 years, the method became widely accepted, including adoption by the U.S. Army. Because Drs. Elam and Safar refused to let the rediscovery of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation fade back into the history books, Jean Stowell, like thousands before her, knew exactly what to do when she found her grandson lying at the bottom of the family pool in 2010.
I was washing dishes and the kids were playing. All of a sudden, the twins came screaming, Grandma Miles is in the pool. And I went into the pool and was screaming Miles, and nowhere around. And I just instantly went to the deep end. We have a plastic cover, a vinyl cover over the pool. And I started pulling that off, and it's quite heavy. And so I kept pulling, and then his body was there, right on the drain, fetal position. And right away when this was happening, I thought, how am I ever going to tell his mother I lost her baby? I flipped off my shoes, and I went in and went for him, and I just didn't have enough air. And then I went again, and I couldn't get there. And so the third time I was just really determined, and I went for him, and I got him, and I did not get out of the water. I just instantly breathed for him. And of course I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing, but I just did something, kept breathing, and he finally took a breath. I waited, and he seemed to be responding, and so I picked him up and I went to call 911. It was probably 10 minutes for the ambulance to get there. They said on the way to town they were starting an IV, and that's when he woke up and started screaming. So he was completely okay. I just can't emphasize enough how important I think CPR is. And I don't know that I did it right, but I did something. And in an emergency situation, you don't have time to just call and wait. You have to respond.
As modern mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was being developed, doctors recognized that rescue breathing alone was not enough to resuscitate stopped hearts. Among those addressing the problem was Dr. William Kouwenhoven, an electrical engineer who had spearheaded the creation of the defibrillator a decade earlier. While conducting experiments to improve techniques for using defibrillators, Kouwenhoven and his colleagues, Drs. Guy Knickerbocker and James Jude, unexpectedly found that pressing hard on the chest with defibrillator paddles could force blood to flow from the heart. That prompted them to focus their efforts on what later would become known as closed-chest cardiac massage. They knew that if they could prove its effectiveness at artificially circulating blood during cardiac arrest, closed chest compression would be a welcome alternative to surgically opening the chest and directly squeezing the heart. Eventually, their theories moved out of the lab and into the hospital. Dr. Jude led the research on human subjects. When a patient on the operating table or in the emergency room went into ventricular fibrillation, a resident started closed chest compression and kept pumping while a defibrillator, a descendant of the one Kouwenhoven had first developed, was located and rushed to the patient. The process worked. Patients survived. And best of all, it was simple.
Dr. Kouwenhoven described that very early. He said, as he kind of chewed on his pipe, he would say, you know, anybody can do this as long as they have two hands.
When Kouwenhoven, Saffer, and Jude presented their findings on external compression and ventilation at a conference in Maryland in September 1960, and announced that combining the two methods produced the first truly effective approach to resuscitation, they made history and changed lives. No longer would individuals have to stand by helplessly when a stranger or loved one suddenly collapsed. Instead, they could put their hands on that person and help, buying precious time by keeping them alive until medical personnel arrived. The Baltimore Fire Department, which had played such a key role in mouth-to-mouth resuscitation experiments, was the first to take the life-saving technique into the field. Once it had been proven in the field, Drs. Saffer, Elam, Kouwenhoven, Jude, and Knickerbocker devoted themselves to making CPR public knowledge. The American Heart Association, which coined the term CPR in 1962, helped promote the method to doctors and nurses. A few years later, training was broadened to include firefighters and ambulance personnel.
In 1966, the National Academy of Sciences endorsed training for the public. Well, that effort got a big boost by pioneering work in the Seattle area. This area had a very progressive fire department and was one of the first 5 paramedic programs in the country. The chief, Gordon Vickery, and the medical director, Leonard Cobb, saw the value in training the public in CPR.
We thought we would develop a program of providing hospital-type care to on the street, and mostly to patients that had heart attacks, but also to patients that collapsed suddenly, or to other forms of acute illnesses.
Together, Cobb and Vickery launched a massive education program to train everyone how to perform CPR. The first goal was to train 100,000 people in compact 3-hour sessions. Seattle's population was 500,000 at the time. The program became a huge success. Cobb and Vickery forged the trail for many organizations who now train millions of citizens each year. Many people, like Desiree, received their first CPR training in school.
I had left school early and was walking down to the bus stop to catch my bus home, and there was a group of people standing around a man who had fallen and was turning purple, and nobody was doing anything. Nobody had called 911, nothing. So I stepped in and told somebody to call 911 and started to perform hands-only CPR. Everybody was telling me not to touch him, that if I touched him I was going to get in trouble. I didn't know what was going on. I shouldn't touch him. It was kind of frustrating because there was a ton of adults, like 30 adults standing around this man, and it took me, a teenager, to step over there and say that something needed to be done. Just because of the CPR training that I had received in high school, I knew what to do in a situation like that. I knew the signs of when somebody needs CPR. was kind of calm to like go over the steps of CPR in my head and what I had learned in the class. My friends were very proud of me, and I guess I kind of inspired them because a lot of them actually went out and started to learn CPR. I can always look back on and know that I did something good, and it's something that's always going to stay with me, and I'll know that if I'm ever in that situation again, I'll be able to do it again.
What makes Desiree's story particularly noteworthy is that only about 1/3 of people trained in CPR decide to use it in an emergency situation. Often, they simply freeze.
As a paramedic, I've showed up several times. We get the call, 911, you have a response to a cardiac emergency or cardiac arrest, and everyone is just standing around, whether it's coworkers or whether it's loved ones. They could have been doing CPR prior to our arrival, and it's unfortunate because if we were able to have people doing CPR, it could possibly save that person's life.
Well, reluctance to act is more likely if you're surrounded by a crowd. There's a natural tendency to think, number one, if you're not sure of what to do, you just hope and think that somebody's got to know more than you do. And number two, you're waiting for somebody else to take the initiative to guide you, to trigger your actions.
Training is what helped Desiree overcome this tendency, even when adults discouraged her from acting. She had practiced CPR numerous times in school prior to the incident, and the process was almost automatic for her. In recent years, emergency services in some regions have been reaching out to bystanders to give them the confidence to act. In Seattle and King County, Washington, 911 operators have been successfully talking bystanders through CPR by phone. As a result, the number of cardiac arrest victims receiving CPR from a bystander has increased from 27%, the national norm, to 56%. That contributes to the region's phenomenal 46% rate of survival from the same kind of sudden cardiac arrest suffered by Stuart Thompson, a survival rate that's more than twice the national norm. Chrissy and Albie Natalini will always be grateful for the extra help they received from a 911 operator soon after bringing their new baby home from the hospital.
We had a beautiful baby girl on February 19th, 2008.
Come home to, I guess, the typical balloons, neighbors, with your family there.
And that evening, we put our daughter down for rest. She had fallen asleep. About an hour and a half later, I woke up startled, thinking, why hasn't she woken up to breastfeed? And when I glanced down at her, she was pale. She didn't seem to be breathing. When I picked her up, everything flung back. She just was like a rag doll.
When I took Layla, at first I saw her, she was very pale and limp. She wasn't moving.
He ran over and grabbed her from me and held her up to the light to make sure that her chest wasn't rising, and it wasn't. And so we brought her back into the living room and started doing CPR.
Once I actually started doing the CPR, I do remember my wife talking to the 911 operator on the phone, giving her somewhat instructions on what to do. Even though we have taken 2 classes in CPR, I was still not totally confident that what I was doing was correct.
So she helped us count a little bit faster as we were doing the compressions, and my husband did the breathing part, and we just continued for about 12 minutes until the paramedics arrived.
Albie and Chrissy's story is also a reminder that mouth-to-mouth breathing remains a vital part of helping people in many types of emergencies, like those involving children or drowning victims. This is especially true in developing countries, where roughly 1 million newborns are dying from birth asphyxia, and drowning is more common. Steps such as making CPR training widely accessible and providing guidance from 911 operators during an emergency certainly build the confidence of bystanders and encourage them to act. But the latest chapter in the remarkable story of CPR makes it even easier to give aid, especially when you see an adult suddenly collapse.
The current hands-only guidelines has made the public want to do CPR. It simplified things for them. They're just doing hands-only CPR. They're not doing breaths. They're not checking for a pulse. And before, I think people were reluctant to do CPR. Even if they knew CPR and they didn't know someone, they may have been hesitant to do that. So it really has simplified things.
Deborah Bader would discover, in a particularly striking way, just how simple and effective the method is for helping an adult who has suddenly collapsed.
We were in the woods walking pretty far away from anything. And he turned to me and he gave me this look like he was going to give me some really bad news. And he fell over backwards and immediately fished out his cell phone, dialed 911, started screaming because I hoped someone else would hear us and call 911 too. And I immediately started hands-only CPR, chest compressions at a very fast rate that I'd learned from watching, of all things, YouTube videos about the American Heart Association's message that we should not hesitate, not wait. When an adult goes down, immediately perform hands-only CPR.
She immediately realizes what's going on and starts doing hands-only CPR. And she evidently does it pretty well because I actually came to the same day. I don't really remember that day, but I was actually conscious that evening.
So it was really through the public service announcements and the staying alive message that was going around at the time on the radio that I'd heard that you needed to do fast and quick to a really fast rhythm, to the rhythm of the Bee Gees, Staying Alive tune.
Simplifying CPR for emergencies like the one Deborah encountered is just one more way to improve the chance that bystanders can and will help a victim. But communities can further increase the chance of surviving a cardiac arrest by implementing an effective system of care. An ideal system for responding to such emergencies is often described as a chain of survival. To fully support this system of care, citizens should have easy access to CPR and AED training programs. In addition, effective CPR assistance from 911 operators should be available at all times. After all, as our rescue stories have demonstrated, you can't predict when or where you'll need to use CPR, or if it will be a stranger in need, or a member of your own family. In other words, you'll never know what your hands will be called on to do.
It's just, I guess what is unbelievable to me is that it works.
When they told me that I had saved his life, I kind of started crying again, but it was more like a relief tears that I had actually helped somebody instead of letting them die on the street.
The one thing that you need to do, you can't do, and that's point to somebody and say, I need help. And so you're relying on somebody else like Steve, who's taken the initiative, got him trained, and Steve did. He hit the long ball that day.